Greetings. Welcome to Someone Talk. I'm your host, Dr. John C. McManus from Missouri S&T. And alongside, as always, are my good friends and partners in crime from the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia, April Cheek Messier and John Long. How goes it today?
Oh, so excited about today.
We are excited. We're looking forward to a lively chat.
Yeah, very good.
Normally, with the recorded ones, they can edit out my puns. But I figure I can squeeze that one in since we're live.
Oh, my.
Yeah, well, here we're stuck with you. I mean, that is the danger of this. And we've known that all along, haven't we? But
Yep.
yeah, I mean, this is a special treat today. I mean, we've had one show in the past that we did live on site at the D-Day Memorial. This one is a live stream, of course, remote. And we're one of the many things that makes it special is our amazing guest. It's Paul Woodadge. Let me just tell you a little bit about Paul's background. So Paul and I are definitely part of the generation that grew up in the shadow of World War II. And as boys, we were just enthralled with anything World War II. Paul, like me, was the type to build models and play with soldiers and knew tons of World War II veterans. Paul has a great uncle who landed at Sword Beach on D-Day, was part of the Royal Ulster Rifles. So, of course, Paul, as I can very much relate to, of course, he grew up in England, I grew up in America, but there's really no difference in terms of just how enthralled we were in World War II. So what's really remarkable about what Paul Woodadge has done, he's parlayed that into just an amazing career. Over many visits to Normandy as a young person in the 1980s and going forward. And then, of course, reenacting. Paul was a very serious reenactor. Ultimately, he moved to Normandy, I think in 2001, and became really the number one battlefield guide / historian for the better part of almost 2 decades. And he still does some guiding, but he's also an author. He's written a book called Angels of Mercy, which is about a couple of American medics in Angleville-au-Plaine as part of the Normandy campaign, of course, too. And of course, you can still visit the church where they treated the wounded and find remnants of the blood of the wounded there. Paul really brought that to life in an amazing book, again, called Angels of Mercy. And his more recent project in the last several years has been WW2 TV, which is mainly platform is on YouTube, but it is just an amazing kind of scholarly and popular exploration of any topic related to World War II that you could possibly imagine. Paul attracts scholars from all over the globe and really a very diverse kind of multicultural group with constant reinterpretation of World War II. So we felt that, we wanted to kind of prevail on Paul to come in today, and there was nobody better we could think of for the live stream, because this is what Paul does for a living. And does it extremely well. So, Paul Woodadge, it is such a pleasure to have you today. Obviously, full disclosure, we are friends, and I just wanted to thank you personally for coming on today.
Well, thank you for the invite. I didn't recognize myself from that pretty incredible introduction there. Is that me? Did I do all that? But yeah, no, I've been here in Normandy for 23 years now and seen the changes, and was here for the 45th, 50th, 50th, 5th, and a lot of the ones in between. And it's been remarkable seeing the changes to how we look at history and how D-Day is considered and viewed by the general public. So yeah, delighted to talk to you.
Yeah, so with the 80th anniversary really imminent, we figured there's nobody who has a better feel for that than you, as you said, having seen it over such a long period of time, and of course being immersed in it now, living in Bayeux. But the other thing that makes this this particular episode unique is obviously there's a live stream. So I wanted to also mention that our podcast producer Angela Lynch is going to be fielding your live questions. And Angela, if you could tell us how that works. that would be great.
Hey, good morning, everyone. We have actually quite a few people already in the chat, and they're saying hello to one another and kind of building some community there. So welcome, everybody. If you're hearing the sound of our voices right now, you probably have already seen that Someone Talked live chat box right there on the left side of your screen. And all you need to do to jump in on the conversation at any point is type your question right there in the chat box. Hit enter, and I will be relaying those to our hosts to get all of the answers that you're just dying to know today. One other little housekeeping bit that I will mention is if you are listening and you hear a train, do not worry. that actually is completely normal. Our podcast studio, we typically record and edit. It is located adjacent to the train tracks here in beautiful downtown Bedford, Virginia, USA. But we can't edit when we're live. So that's the magic of live podcasts, and we're just gonna roll with it. So, and if you have any questions for our team or me as we roll along, enter those in the chat as well.
Yeah, that'll be such a fun part of the day. All the questions you have, whatever, is on your mind. We know everything, but among us, I think we can take a stab at it. And that's just kind of the fun of it, to see wherever this conversation takes us. And also the other thing I want to mention is that, obviously he goes by Paul, but his friends often call him Woody. So if I slip that in, I'm talking about Paul Woodadge, and that's just his nickname of those who know and love him, among the many. So, Woody, you just mentioned that you've seen all these marker anniversaries. Obviously, you've lived in Normandy. What is it? I think 23 years, right?
Yeah,
something like that. I don't know that there's anybody, better qualified to kind of comment on how you've seen this evolve. What do you think about that? What do you think 80th is going to be versus, say, the 60th?
Well, huge. I mean, every time there is one, they think, well, it can't get bigger. And then it gets bigger. And they're anticipating 2 million people a year normally in Normandy. They're thinking that between 1 and 1.5 million will be here that week. So we're going to get 2/3 of the yearly total in 1 week, in an area that can't really support it in a sense. The beaches, they seem big when you're there on your own. When you're there with thousands of people, it's very different. So just the enormity, I think, is the big thing we're going to be bowled away by. We think we're prepared for it, but I don't think we are.
So you have mixed emotions about it all, don't you?
I do. I try not to be, too cynical about it, being middle-aged, but I feel it's always about the tonal shift. I find odd because you have people coming here for very different reasons, and the language is all important. There, where I live, just around the corner on June the 7th, I think it is, there'll be a liberation ball. So there'll be a Glenn Miller style band playing, and people go there and they jitterbug and jive and they have fun, and that's absolutely fine. That's celebrating the liberation that was brought about by those events. But you also get people coming to acknowledge where their loved ones fell, and they want to go and lay wreaths at cemeteries or graves or beaches where they fell. And you have other people who want to show off their military collections, their jeeps, their Deuce and a Half, their tanks, and it's all happening in the same space at the same time. And I find that a little bit confusing at times. I mean, the analogy I use is a church can have a wedding happening and a funeral happening, and there might be a cake bake happening there, but this is all happening at the same time. They're the funeral, the wedding, and the cake bake are happening in the same space at the same time, and that's what Normandy kind of is in June. All these things. People selling commemorative hot dogs at the same time as another tour group is talking about how Fred, the grandfather, lost his best friends on that corner. That's where I struggle a little bit, just dealing with that complex set of reasons people come here.
Paul, I have a question for you. So, first of all, I have to tell you, I'm a huge fan of WW2 TV. I've watched so many episodes, and you have such a diverse group of people who come on that you talk to, and I just love that, and including quite a few female historians, which is always nice to see. So I appreciate that. That's great. But I first came across your name many years ago, you wrote a chapter in a book called Managing and Interpreting D-Day Sites of Memory,
Oh, yeah.
Guardians of Remembrance by Jeffrey Bird. And I actually wrote a chapter in that book too. So we're both in that book. So I came across your name years ago and I loved what you wrote in the book. One of the things that you talked a little bit about was you mentioned the movie Band of Brothers, of course, epic film Band of Brothers. And as your experience as a guide, it seems like that changed people's perception of D-Day. Here we are coming across, a big anniversary, 80th anniversary. Can you talk a little bit about, as a battlefield historian, that transition, what you saw kind of emerge after, a film like Band of Brothers, what people's perceptions were like following that?
Well, it was Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan. Of course, the two came one behind the other. And I think it probably changed the fact that before that, people came here having used books as their primary understanding of what happened, and perhaps photographic evidence from the time, and some of those famous, the Robert Capa photos, things like that. But for the first time, people coming with an idea of what happened from the visual power of a TV series, a very, very authentic TV series, and a very, good movies. I'm not knocking them, but it meant that people's their primary understanding had changed, and it's got more so since then, because people are coming using many more types of media to understand the events. Video games, blogs, and YouTube channels, and podcasts, all these things there, and I think it's complicated what the way people take on information, and the way they then take that information and compare it to the reality of standing at a location like Omaha Beach or Villa Bocage or wherever it would be. So it had a definite effect on people's stimuli, if that makes sense.
Definitely.
Paul, let's go back to the very beginning. How and when did you become so intrigued with the history of the Second World War, and what makes it such a compelling story for you, and how do you pass that love of the history on to other people?
Well, I do not remember not being interested. I mean, I there isn't a before. I went to visit my parents, who are getting on a bit now. My mum has Parkinson's, and she's clearing some stuff out, and she gave me an art project I'd done at primary school, elementary school, when I was 6, and she said, "Here's the painting you did." It was of a Spitfire and paratroopers jumping on D-Day with helicopter blades instead of a parachute. So I invented some kind of tech that hadn't been invented. So seeing that, I'd forgotten I'd drawn that. So that was, I was 5 or 6. So it was just everything. I mean, I grew up like John did, when veterans just lived. They were the people. They were the scoutmasters. They were the teachers. They were the authority figures in the village I grew up. So there was nothing special about them in that sense. They were just the elders when I was growing up. My scoutmaster, when I was a Boy Scout, was a D-Day veteran, and so I don't remember not being interested. And now I to build on what you said about how I share it, I share, as John said, via YouTube, because I realized that there are a whole generation of people who don't read books, and that's fine. I read lots of books, but they take their information other ways, which kind of leads off what you were both saying a minute ago. And there are people who want to learn about this history, but don't necessarily know. They don't know the paths to understanding it that I knew. When I had to go to a thing called a library, which some people don't remember, and look up books on an index and request books that come from other libraries on subjects. And there's people there who want that information, but are different to me. So I'm trying to give the information for those people. I think about my stepdaughters, how they assimilate the information that they get about their daily lives. So that's the gap I try and bridge between generations, I suppose, if that doesn't sound a bit more worthy than it actually is, which is basically me waffling about the war. But yeah.
Well, it's all about education. I mean, and that it's about what's most effective in terms of engaging people and helping them understand. I mean, we were fortunate in a way to grow up in the shadow of World War II veterans, as we did. Like you said, they were elders, and it's I say this sometimes now, and I hope not too irreverently. It was almost a matter of supply and demand. I mean, back then, like you said, Woody, I mean, World War II veterans were everywhere. Everybody was, all these guys who were middle aged at that point when we were children were World War II veterans, and we knew them, as friends and people, and had relationships along those lines. And obviously, by now, that has become much more rare. So I think that in some ways, the parallel I always think about is Bruce Caton, who was a Civil War historian, who came along, kind of similar in terms of the Civil War to the way we did in relation to World War II later, but knew a lot of these guys, and that shaped his work. And I think that was something of an advantage for us, but also maybe a disadvantage in the sense that it could become too personal and maybe too close to the event. So I think sometimes the new one, and this is what I really like about WW2 TV, among many things, that the younger historians than we are, who didn't necessarily have that firsthand association with World War II on a personal level, I think can come at it maybe sometimes from a more objective angle than we can, and ask questions that we never would have thought of. Is there any particular part of WW2 TV that stands out to you, like an episode or two where that just kind of slapped you over the head, like, oh my gosh, this is a completely different perspective now?
Lots of occasions. That, I mean, for me, the continual process is the learning. That I go into subjects going, well, I know nothing about that, and I come out knowing a bit more. And what? No, it's not quite the exact example that it ties in what you're saying, but I grew up with the comics. Comic books was my primary thing, and I was just shuffling through some a few hours ago. And in fact, I didn't even know as a young kid the Americans were involved in World War II. There's kind of a joke in Normandy that Americans don't realize the British were involved. But as a kid, I don't think I knew you guys were. I think I just thought it was Tommy Atkins winning Battle of Alamein on his own. And it was Australians. We wrote about the Australians. The Australians were these rugged, dogged, always stripped to the waist with tattoos. And they were always winning the battles. They were somehow tougher than us. And I did a show with an Australian historian, Mark Johnston, about an Australian unit that's kind of called the Australian Band of Brothers. They did multiple campaigns, and they kind of went from the Pacific to the Mediterranean to the Pacific, and he was saying that these Australian veterans in the desert, in Tobruk, in the siege there, living in foxholes that were 6 inches deep, being shelled by the Italians and the Germans, and this, that, and the other, were receiving anonymous little parcels from Australian civilians with white feathers in and things like that, and letters saying, you're a coward because you're not protecting Australia's shores. And these people who had somehow got misguided about Australia's involvement and politics and things like that, and there you are sitting in a shell scrape outside of Tobruk, and someone's bothering to go and send a package off to an anonymous veteran saying, you're a coward, you're not defending Australia's shores. And that was an absolute mic drop moment for me, that these Australians might be seeing the events differently to my perception of how they perceive these events. And those kind of things happen to me all the time. Just a couple of nights ago on World War II TV, Matthew Parker was on, who did a fantastic book about Monte Cassino 20 years ago, talking about the people were opening up to him who'd never opened up to their families, and about just the misery of the Italian campaign, which I know is close to your heart, John. So it's that the mic drop moments for me are being reminded basically how awful it all was and how miserable it all was all the time. And sometimes I get a little obsessed about trying to work out which way D Company went, and did they overtake E Company, and was the Italian orders coming through from this, and that's important history, but understanding what the people went through is fundamental, I think, and I have to be reminded of that sometimes.
And Woody, I think one of the things that stands out for me with you saying that, I was struck by something. I was reading something that you had said that your grandmother, I think, looked after an evacuee from London, as well as, of course, her own 2 children, which included your mother. And I've always been fascinated by that because, talking about what people went through. And I think sometimes as Americans, we forget just the circumstances, particularly when you look at the mass evacuation that happened, over 1.5 million people moving out of London, I mean, hundreds of thousands of them are school children, and thinking about that separation and that anxiety and moving them into the countryside, the logistics of that, everything that went on. And then, this touched your family directly. I mean,
Yep.
did your grandmother and your mother, did they talk about that much? And what did they share to you about their
Well, they
experiences
did,
with that?
and you're absolutely right. It was an incredibly traumatic experience for the families, because they're having to act my grandmother would have to act as a surrogate mother to a kid
Mhm.
whose mother was alive and well but living in London.
Yeah.
And that response, but Colin, who was the evacuee in question, right, who I think I met when I was very young, Colin, we looks back on that era as the very best time of his childhood, because he was in the countryside with enough to eat and doing extraordinary things he'd never had a chance to do from the city of London. It was him and his sister. I forget what the sister was called. So they were 6 and 3 or something when they went out in 1940, and they stayed there till they were 9 and 5 or whatever it was. And it was this, seeing horses and cattle and fields, because my grandmother was in kind of rural Suffolk. So nowhere near any bombing targets, really. There were a few airfields later on. So I don't want to come away with the idea that the evacuee experience was fundamentally miserable. It was, and also exciting. That's the paradox of these events being two things at the same time. That it's a traumatic experience, but it could also be a brilliant one as well. And yet that I think was what they would say, that the complicated, nuanced feelings of this sort of family coming together that spent more time together over those next 3 years than a real family, in a sense.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's complicated but fascinating.
Yeah. Well, war is complicated on so many
Yeah.
levels. So yeah.
Paul, let's delve into our main subject matter. April and I, of course, would have our answers to this question, but I'm curious about yours. D-Day, when you get down to it, was just one day out of a war that went on for years. And yet it's one day that gets so much attention. Why do you think that is? Why is it get so much attention in popular culture and scholarly research? What is it about D-Day?
I'll go first. Want to hear what John says. I think it's because it seemingly has a very neat beginning and a very neat end. It's a package you can deliver tied up with a ribbon on top. At the beginning of the day, the Germans held the beaches, and at the end of the day, the Allies held the beaches, and it comes together very well. Here's the leadership chain. This is the plan. It more or less worked. This bit worked. This bit followed this bit. This bit followed this bit. You can follow that timeline through, and you get that end of, metaphorically but literally, Allied troops marching up the bluffs to liberated villages. And I see it as a tour guide, and my partner as a tour guide, is that people go away with a sense of completion. I don't let my clients go away with a sense of completion. I remind them there's 76 more days of very complicated fighting that went in some ways very differently to how the Allies had expected it. But if you take it at its face value, June the 6th is a neat package, neater than Monte Cassino, neater than the Pacific Campaign, neater than the bombing campaign. And I'm seeing John nodding there. So, John, do you kind of agree with me in that regard?
No, absolutely. It's a tight story in that sense, and I think beyond that, most history is like over time and full of all these sort of ups and downs. Especially the farther back we go in history, it's like, okay, well, here's the 30 Years' War. So, what happened in that 10 years that between these campaigns or whatever. And this is even in modern history unusual that we can point to one day on which the world clearly changed and which so much was at stake from a Western perspective. Admittedly, if you're a Soviet soldier, June 6, 1944 is a day like any other, fighting it out and maybe not surviving wherever you are in Poland or something. But from a Western perspective, this is what, Anglo-Americans have been working toward for years, really, honestly. And it comes off well. It's like, it's fascinating on the level of planning, what has to be done for this thing to succeed. It's dramatic places and events. It's some place we can relate to, France, because people go there as tourists or whatever. But I tend to see it also inevitably always from an American perspective, I guess. That I really believe that this is a day we can point to when the United States becomes what we all think of it as now, this sort of international superpower.
Mhm.
That's really where we see it, and of course, Normandy invasion is a team effort, and the Americans are the minority, but they're the plurality, if that makes sense. So, but I think it's really a harbinger for what's going to come, in addition to the alliance, which will kind of become NATO going forward. So it's so relatable. And like you said, Woody, it's a tight story in the sense of there's closure in that it succeeds. But the concern I always have, and we've discussed this, is that then it's too easy, neat a narrative. Like, okay, well, the war's over, and of course it's just beginning. I mean, it's you've got about a year of horrible fighting.
Yeah,
D-Day is really quite atypical, really, when you think about it on that level. So I just think if you're sort of a tourist on the war, it's an easy place to fixate on. And one of the things I see a lot of times in media accounts that really kind of gets in my craw is when I hear it described as a turning point. It's not. The turning points have already happened. It's the wrong phrase. It's a pivot point from which the Allies are going to win the war, I think. And so as I see it, that's what keeps attracting us to this story all these years later. And also, too, I think we've seen it evolve in the commemorations of how we look back at it. And, like now, I think we have a much better sense of the multinational aspects of D-Day, 12 different countries involved, the price the French paid for it all. And I just think that's all to the good that we keep having these kind of new perspectives, I guess.
Can I
I
throw
agree.
out another?
Sorry.
Can I throw out another point? I'd love to hear both of you comment on this. D-Day also was unusual during the war in that it was the one day everyone knew was going to happen. Most of the other battles, pick another one, Iwo Jima. No one was anticipating an invasion of Iwo Jima until it happens. And yet D-Day, there is this lead up of months and months and months where people are debating over coffee in the mornings where the landings are going to be, where the soldiers in England are talking about, when does it happen? I think that's carried forward into our modern memory of the event, that this was the most anticipated day of World War II.
No, I agree. And I think what you both said, it's also the general public have an ownership of D-Day that they don't have perhaps of other battles. I mean, Gettysburg perhaps as well, Waterloo maybe, because it's so well known that people have come up with their own language. And it's not, there are other battles where historians drive the narrative, but I think D-Day, the public, journalism, films, comics drive the narrative. And, I want to get into language later on, because I think some of the words that are used to describe D-Day, about it, well, yes, the fate of the world was dependent on it, but I firmly believe it wasn't as risky as some people think it was. It was, the chances of it actually going wrong. Amphibious landings generally go pretty well on the first day. I mean, there's very few that don't really go well. Losses can be high, but but this idea that it was it could have failed, halfway through, and that's as we get towards June, I'm just bracing myself for the flurry of the 10 things about D-Day you didn't know, 9 of which will be fake, and the 10th one is spurious, and it all worked because Hitler was asleep and Hitler didn't send the tanks in, and that I just go, a little bit of me dies inside every time I read that those things. So it's D-Day. It's different to the other invasions, but at the same time, it's typical of them and atypical of them. It's, you compare it to Salerno and Anzio, the planning for Overlord was 1,000,000 times greater than most of those, and yet it's got this idea that it was on a knife edge, which I don't really think is true. I'd love to see what John thinks to that.
I mean, the percentages are definitely in favor of success. There's absolutely no question. And it almost kind of reminds me of a really well-staged production or play. If you've done all the legwork ahead of time, if you've rehearsed, if you've got professionals, if you've got your stage and you can control it, it's probably going to be successful. And I think the Normandy invasion is kind of like that, but it also becomes this. There's no question you're also dealing with a peer operator in terms of your adversary. Although the Germans are diminished, they're still quite dangerous, and there's a lot of ways this war could turn out that are really not the way what we would want. And so I think that there is that sense of possibility of something going wrong, if not even always of being repulsed at the beaches, but not necessarily getting what we want after,
Yeah.
I mean, whatever way it would go, but yeah, there is that sense of drama, even on the term D-Day, right? Because it becomes ubiquitous, or it's a ubiquitous term for many amphibious invasions, but we always associate it with Normandy, don't we?
We do. Yeah.
And of course you also have on the other side of the world, I always point this out, General Douglas MacArthur, who out of spite will then name his major invasions, and they're almost equivalent to Normandy. He'll use different letters like S-Day and A-Day and all this kind of stuff just to spite, because he associates the term D-Day with Eisenhower. So, I mean,
acting out of spite. Whatever next, John? MacArthur getting personally involved in something. Just
can't be mentioned.
Yeah, I have to sit down after that.
I know that's news to you. Absolutely, it is.
That's another podcast for another time.
It is, which would be a good one.
It could.
So, Angela, I think we've got a question.
Well, and I always enjoy a good conversation about pettiness. So there we have it. We do have a couple of listener questions, and the first one is from Norma, and she asks, Woody, how do the people in Normandy feel about D-Day? I would imagine they have complicated feelings about it.
The lovely Norma, Canada's finest ambassador of D-Day history. Well, it's interesting because the people who live in the places where the most D-Day tourism occurs aren't necessarily locals. Okay, so the people who inhabit the square of Sainte Mary Église or Aramonche or even Bayeux, where I live, they've, like tour guides, they've moved to the region to take advantage of the tourism. Okay, and I'm not saying anything negative about that. Okay, so those people, the people running bars in Sainte Mary Église, rub their hands with glee. The amount of I've heard all these tales of how many beer trucks are bringing up kegs of beer up to the bars in Sainte Mary Église. So they look forward to it, and not just for money making, but because they love the festival aspect of it. This wonderful gathering of people from across the world for different reasons. So they look forward to it. But then there are other people who don't. So Mag, my other half, who's French, Norman, born and bred, born in Saint-Lô, she's got relatives who live in the Saint-Marcouf area behind Utah Beach. And Saint-Marcouf was the village in La Manche, the department, that suffered the most civilian casualties on June the 6th in the bombardment. And near Saint-Marcouf is the Crisbec Battery, a museum with the guns and replica guns and things, all the bunkers there. And they have I think it's happening this year, but they have certainly in previous years had a big kind of nighttime spectacular with gunfire and lasers and fireworks and to represent the Allied invasion. Now, one of Mag's relatives just leaves the village for that week because it brings back disturbing memories of hearing that for real. So Normandy has people who absolutely look forward to it, the anniversary happening, and people who dread it. And not just the inconvenience of you can't get, you go down to the shops to get a baguette and there's a GMC and a Sherman tank parked in your regular spot, So every kind of reaction from oh my God, I can't wait till it's over, to I can't wait for it to all be here. That what I was saying earlier about this. These different types of reasons for people coming here. So some people are very grumpy about it, and some people are very happy about it, and everything in between is the answer, Norma.
Yeah, I could see that easily. We have another listener question, and keep them coming. This is fun, kind of moderating everything and seeing what people are thinking. This question is from Buzz Upton, and he asks, "What is the British view of General Montgomery's performance on D-Day and the following 30 days?"
I'll go and get comfy there. How long have we got?
That's another podcast for another time.
Okay.
We're just taking notes here. About
Yeah. Thank you for giving us content for
That's
the
right.
next 6 months.
So we've done Montgomery and MacArthur already. So let me break it down. Okay. So as John said at the beginning, my great uncle was on Sword Beach on D-Day, which was the most defended beach in terms of German batteries, bunkers, obstacles, machine guns than any of the other four. It is just a fact. Okay. The quality of the troops is a different question, and how inactive the bunkers and guns were is a different question. But in terms of sheer volume, that was the most German bunkers behind that beach. And my great uncle, he wasn't first wave. Arrived middle of the morning. He's got to a position sort of 2 or 3 miles inland by the end of June the 6th. And most of the people he knew, most people in the British 3rd Division, had got to at least pretty close to where they were going to get that day. So in that regards, Sword Beach was a successful landing. What people mean by Montgomery is they mean the failure to get Caen, which is a connected subject, but not quite the same subject. And in fact, when people ask about Montgomery, they really mean Miles Dempsey, the commander of Second Army, because Montgomery isn't directly involved in the taking of Caen because he's got a higher position than that. Dempsey is more involved in that. And my great uncle, I can only speak for him, was very miffed that for years and years, historians would write about the failure of getting to Caen, the implication being that Sword Beach had been a failure. Because he was like, well, it didn't feel like a failure to me. Yes, I lost some friends, and yes, there were casualties, but so there's a simple question there, but there's not a simple answer to it. It's a very complicated, nuanced thing. I think British people, I think people generally, historians are coming round to understand that Montgomery was better than a lot of people gave him credit for, although a very prickly person who I probably wouldn't get on with socially. But that doesn't mean he isn't a good commander. And it's not the question that Buzz asked, but when people say Montgomery was hopeless, he shouldn't have been there, I always say, well, who else then? Who would you propose to do the job better than Montgomery? And I can never come up with a name of anybody that could have done that job better. Lots that could do it worse, but I can't come up with a name of anyone who would do it better. So that's my kind of slightly long-winded, not answering the exact question response to that. But I could go further in if you want me to.
No, it'd be interesting to hear. I mean, you asked the question. I would say Slim was one possibility, while also respecting Montgomery, as I do. What do you think about that? And I'll throw that out.
Absolutely, except why the hell would you take Slim away from the area where he has incredible specialist knowledge? And that Slim can, whatever it was, speak 3 different Indian languages, working knowledge of Chinese, Japanese, etc., etc., etc. Gets all the cultures of the makeup of the 14th Army. Has spent 3 or 4 years by 44 building up a good idea of what doesn't work in that theatre, what does work, what tech will come in to change things. So, pressing a magic button and moving him away from the theatre he's got really good at and dropping him into the ETO seems as potentially a good a job as he might have done at the ETO. Who are you going to replace him with in Burma? So Slim is probably my favorite general of World War II, certainly my favorite British general of World War II. And Robert Lyman has written about him extensively, as Slim wrote about himself. But yeah, I agree with you, John. If you could clone Slim, if you could have a Star Wars technology, have a second Slim that can move up to Europe and from 42 onwards kind of grow to become the ETO Slim whilst retaining the Southeast Asia Slim, that I'm on board with that one, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a good point. He's a fit for where he is, and they go with what they have, and what they have is Montgomery, who isn't half bad. I mean, this is what the whole. I'm so ambivalent about Montgomery, always have been, of course, and I think maybe you feel that way too. But he on the one hand, he really is ideal in that he gets the kind of force he's in charge of. He gets the paucity of manpower resources because obviously he's lived that. And I think Americans tend to overlook this, how much combat he saw in World War I, how fortunate he was to survive World War I of being badly wounded. I always think that, many of his colleagues who could have been very successful commanders of World War II were actually killed in World War I. And so Montgomery was a fortunate survivor on that level. So he really gets that. I think he has a humanity about him, but he's also his own worst enemy in that, like you said, I don't know that we'd get on with him socially because he has this incredible knack for just saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. He can't help himself. He's just so obnoxious on so many levels, and he's so self-serving. And the Khan thing, I think, is a prime example. There's no shame in not taking Khan on D-Day or D+1 or whatever. It's a long way off from Sword Beach, and Sword Beach is really a successful landing, like you said. But Montgomery created that whole thing, and then, kind of stokes the controversy by denying it sort of for the rest of his life.
He moves the goalpost all the time. That's his problem. I mean, I kind of jokingly say that if he had happened to have been sitting next to Patton in the car in 45 and had been killed alongside Patton, what they'd have been talking about, I don't know. But I think his reputation would have immediately been higher because it was the constant toing and froing after war in his memoirs of, no, I always planned that. You didn't. Like when cats knock something over, but give you that look that they intended to do that. You go, well, they fall over and they jump up and go, no, I meant to do that. You go, no, you didn't. That's Montgomery to a T. Montgomery is the cat pretending he didn't slip, and it's a weird analogy, and the more he just dug his hole deeper and deeper in his memoirs and his interviews and was not good at sharing out the love and sharing out the credit, and that's where I find him very, very difficult to like, and yet I have to admire what he did. I have to admire he was a good all-rounder. I don't think there's anything he's particularly brilliant at, but don't think there's anything he's particularly bad at. I think he's a good 7 out of 10 at most aspects, whereas some generals will clearly score 10 in certain aspects. Patton would score 10 in some, but would get 3 in some, or 2, or 1. Montgomery is like a 7, a good, solid 6 or 7 at most things, which is kind of what you want for something as large and potentially unwieldy as 21st Army Group in Normandy and beyond, which is the biggest formation of forces brought together, I assume, in one place, in one landmass ever. So yeah, I have this begrudging love for Montgomery, but at the same time, I can't stand him. It's weird.
There's an ambivalence about him, right? I mean, he's just, it's interesting because I think among Americans, there's this sort of caricature of Montgomery, and it comes from the movie Patton to a great extent. And I get it, but I also think it's a bit unfair. And of course, it comes from Saving Private Ryan too, where there's this sort of bizarre conversation between two captains ripping on Montgomery as somehow responsible for the campaign being difficult. And that's the only mention of the British in the whole movie. And it's just, I don't know who decided on that, but that was not wise in my opinion. So I think Montgomery, it's our job as historians to kind of get beyond the caricature. Like you said, and say, okay, this is who this guy really was. These were his strengths and weaknesses. Then you decide what you make.
I'm going to bring in this.
It works both ways, because if Americans have a caricatured vision of Montgomery, I think Brits conversely have a caricatured vision of Patton, which they then use to think about every American general. They think they all were kind of the showy, shiny insignia and ivory handle, this, that, and the other. And Patton is probably an exception to the rule in that sense. Mark Clark, I suppose, is a bit showy, but a lot of them aren't. Simpson, people like that, they're the antithesis of Patton. So cliched visions from the movies are damaging generally, but at the same time, so self-fulfilling in that they have some truth. Don't get me started on the British stopping for tea thing, because British when they are stopped will immediately have tea, but they don't usually stop for tea, and it's language.
I mean, if it just happens to be there.
Yeah.
Norma actually had a comment along those lines in the chat, saying that Canadian military historian Terry Kopp called Monty, quote, a very average general, not bad, not great, just average. So a bit of Canadian perspective there for your thoughts.
Yeah, fair from the god that is Terry Kopp. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
Yeah. Terry Kopp. If you haven't heard of Terry Kopp, he's one of the all-time greats, arguably the greatest ever Canadian military historian, certainly in the conversation, and knows Normandy backwards and forwards. And I mean the ground. Terry Kopp used to take students there. I mean, he spent summers there. It's just amazing work.
Yeah.
Would you all like some more listener questions? We have
Yeah,
several.
Yeah,
please.
All right.
good.
So this one is from Niels, who is asking, what's Paul's favorite D-Day site that people tend to overlook? So now, fair warning, if you tell everybody, they'll show up. So, keep it a secret.
Yeah, I'm assuming that's Niels, Dutch Niels, who's written a book about the German army in the Cotentin, which is going to be a game changer. If it's that Niels, I assume it's that Niels. Favorite D-Day site? It's constantly changing, really. It depends on what I've been reading recently. I like the little town of Port-en-Bessin. I like the commando stories there. It's a great place for battlefield exploration because you can walk around and see German bunkers, and there's cafes. You can have a beer or a coffee or ice cream. You got incredible stories of individual troops of commandos in incredible fighting there. Mostly June the 7th, in fact, rather than June the 6th, because they'd come into the town. So that's a particular favorite place. I like Hillman, the inland position from Sword Beach with the bunkers that the Suffolk Regiment fought over. Lafayette, I love Lafayette, which was American 82nd Airborne on June the 6th. That's a particular favorite place. But sometimes the favorite place is just literally what I've read about, say, the week before, and sometimes I don't even know where the location is. You read a story and you go, "Oh, I wish I knew where that happened." And I don't know where it is, but it can still be a favorite location, even if I don't know where it is. But it's too many to answer. But there are a few that I can think of. Yeah.
So a lot of our audience is American or Canadian, and it's not so easy to pop over to Normandy and see these places. And so it's sort of abstract in a way, but so many just haven't had the chance to visit, but would like to, someday. What do you think if you're visiting for the first time, especially as an American or Canadian tourist? What do you think are the must-visit sites? What would you, narrow it down to? I know you had to set up a lot of tours this way. So how did you typically approach it?
My simple advice is follow a unit. Go from a place on the beach to where they went. I think the mistake is a very harsh word. The way people visit the beaches, the way the tours are structured is you kind of go along the coast, stopping at the various invasion sites. If you come into the port at Ouistreham, you do British and French first, and you go along to Juno Beach and then back the Brits on Gold, then to the Americans on Omaha. And there's lots of value in that, but that's not the way the troops went, of course. The troops didn't land on a beach and go sideways. Actually, the commandos did, but we can talk about that later. But mostly they landed on a beach and had an inland objective. And then beyond that, a second objective and a third and a fourth. And then they leapfrog over each other. So, you have three regiments in a division. So one will be at the front and the other one overtakes and that leapfrogs over and that kind of thing. So people have a desire to kind of collect all the baseball cards. They have to get all those June the 6th sites in, otherwise they don't complete the album. And I say, well, actually, you might be better off just focusing on one or two beaches, but going the direction they went. Okay, you won't see everything, but you get more of an understanding, which I think we're going to get to later, of the idea of the D-Day the D-Day being the first day of a multi-day campaign, rather than this, okay, well, we're won now. Everybody can go back home. So, from Omaha to San Lo, Utah to Cherbourg, Sword Beach to Caen, Gold Beach to Tilly-sur-Seulles, Villa-Bocage. Those, I think, will give you, the visitor, a much better understanding of how the battle was fought, rather than, as I going along and ticking off the June the 6th checklist. If that's my advice. And but it means you won't see everything, but you'll never see everything. I've been living here for 23 years. I haven't seen everything yet. Unfortunately, there's only so many hours in the day.
All right, we're going to hop back in with another listener question. And They're coming in so quickly. I need to get back to scroll up because it just popped down. We have a listener who asked, you mentioned 76 days. That brings it to the middle of August 1944, but the war lasted another year.
Well, that we have to kind of put some marker on the end of the Battle of Normandy, which even that date will be different to different historians, in that there are American soldiers buried in the American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach who were killed on the outskirts of Paris. Now, no one would claim that Paris is Normandy, but that's the end of the chapter turn is kind of mid-August, although technically Le Havre, which is in Normandy, was not liberated till September. So you get a group of historians together in a pub and say, which day did the Normandy campaign end? They'd all slightly argue. When did the Normandy campaign start? It isn't quite as simple as June the 6th, in that you have units knocking out radar stations from typhoons in the days before and the transportation plan. But yeah, so we've kind of agreed that the closing of the Falaise Gap is a starting point to enable us to bring the Battle of Normandy to a close, but it's not definitive. And John probably would have a different opinion to me as when it ends. But I think the liberation of Paris is when you have the kind of big marker in the book and you turn over a big chunk of pages, and then the next chapter begins, and that starts taking us up to the winter of 44, so the Hürtgen Forest and crossing of the Rhine and the liberation of the Low Countries, which has to be a different chapter to Normandy. John, did you disagree or agree?
No, I agree 100%. I mean, it absolutely has to be a different chapter. And then, like you said, Woody, I mean, the hard part is where and when does Normandy end? And it's subsumed in this whole sort of latter part of August is and overlooked is the invasion of South France, which is such a major reason why Normandy ends the way it does, because the Germans are really in crisis throughout all of France. And really their situation in Normandy is no longer tenable, in part because of what's happened in their ill-fated Mortain offensive from August 7th to 12th, I guess. But it all is sort of part of this interlocking puzzle. But then, like this, it's like, we keep joking, well, that could be a whole other podcast. Well, there's the rub of the problem, isn't it? Because
is someone making a list?
Yes, I am actually.
That brings us back to the whole thing about why D-Day is so easy to talk about, because it does tie up neatly if you just keep it at that basic tertiary kind of level. It's a neat bow around it, and the reality is that the liberation of towns in July and August will not get the attention that June the 6th will get this year. That and you don't have to go very far for the dates to leap on a lot. If you go just south of Caen, so Caen is about 9 miles inland from the beach, you have to just go just a couple of miles south, and the date of liberation is August. Or the British airborne on the western flank, you can go to Ronville, which was liberated on June the 6th, and you can travel just 4 or 5 miles east, and you're talking September before it's properly liberated. So there's this real disconnect in that only a few people were liberated by June the 6th. The great effect, Mag was finding some data, I think 60% of Normandy was not liberated till September. So we're not even over half liberated within the first few weeks of D-Day. Yet there is this sense, the media will be putting out the pictures of the grateful French girls and kids in Bayeux seeing de Gaulle visit on the 14th, as if, okay, that's it, the war's over. No, the war is over right there, but it's not over a few miles south. So it is complicated, and I would love to see more attention on the next few weeks and months. And it's gradually happening. The work of our mutual friend James Holland and Peter Caddick Adams and David O'Keefe is doing some amazing work about those inland battles, is gradually pushing people further inland in terms of their wanting to understand it. So I think there's hope on the horizon for D-Day becoming a springboard, which is bringing you back to the Band of Brothers. Band of Brothers is a gateway drug, I always see. If that got people interested in World War II and they went on and started reading John McManus's trilogy about the Pacific, then that's great. They came in via Dick Winters and left by General Eichenberger. That kind of thing would be fine for me.
All the good.
I don't like that.
Well, and as you mentioned, Paul, it is very complicated. I deal with a lot of media questions, especially this time of year when we're coming up on an anniversary, and it's always about dates and numbers. And I'm like, well, it's not quite as black and white on either of those things, as you might imagine. And then sometimes they don't go any further with that line of questioning because it's not something you can succinctly always get the point across in media that way. So another listener question, and this one is for John. I'm assuming McManus, but maybe Long or whoever has an answer can feel free to jump right in. It says, would Eichelberger have been good as land forces commander?
Oh. Well, that was teed up right. Let me this.
And that one's also from Norm.
I mean,
yet another podcast.
Norma brought her A game today.
Our notional Eichelberger leads D-Day podcast. So the job he probably would have had is either one of the Corps commands, like 5th Corps that hits Omaha Beach, or 7th Corps at Utah Beach, or possibly command of 1st Army. Not to cast any aspersions on Generals Bradley and Hodges, who will control 1st Army, at various points in the Normandy invasion and campaign. But I think they do fine. I think they're both competent generals, especially Bradley, who's a fine commander on some levels. But they're not Eichelberger. And Eichelberger is somebody who is, I think, a really first-rate thinker on amphibious invasions. And I mean, he is, and he's going to just take this to a brand new level in the spring and summer 1945 in the Philippines, launching an invasion a day kind of thing. And obviously that's a different animal than Normandy, which is much larger, more complex. But I do think you're probably looking at an operation that is going to be smoother in terms of the ground landings, but in the aftermath is where you're going to see the biggest effect for Eichelberger. Eichelberger, I think, is probably going to be quicker to realize the hedgerow problem than anybody who's on scene, except maybe Joe Collins, who commands 7th Corps. Eichelberger is just one of these difference-making commanders, and the way he's going to lead at Normandy, I would think, if he had been there. He is going. He may not land in the first half of D-Day, but he's going to land at some point on D-Day. He's going to be there at the front. He's going to be at the front in the hedgerows. And so, if we think about it notionally, it's very possible Eichelberger doesn't survive the Normandy invasion if he leads the same way that he did in the Pacific, which is as a veritable squad leader at times. Think of him as a lesser-known Jim Gavin in that respect. So, I think probably you're going to have a little bit of a smoother campaign from an American perspective if Eichelberger's in charge, even though I think the Americans generally have solid commanders, including a really good one in Collins, and they have excellent division commanders like Ridgway. But of course, this is all notional. It's fun to talk about. I mean, who knows? But I think Eichelberger would have done a fantastic job, just my opinion.
My quick answer to Norma's question is yes. He would have done an excellent job. But I think it would be interesting to maybe do a podcast sometime on other commanders in history. How would Pershing have done on D-Day? How would Wellington have done?
Pershing wouldn't have been too worried about the casualties, I guess is one way I could put it, as politely and diplomatically as possible.
Wellington, the Germans were not on his side. You have to remind him, they're not on your side. They're the enemy this time. Your Dukeness. Oh, yeah.
Right.
Don't kill the French, kill the Germans. Yes.
Let's redirect you. Yeah. Russians are bad this time. Yeah.
Russian, yeah. That would be focusing Duke of Wellington on, big Venn diagram. Enemy, not enemy. Got it? Your Dukeness? Yeah. I'm being facetious now, but yeah.
So, Woody, I have a question for you, Woody. So, you've been steeped in this history since birth. So, obviously, your view or understanding of the Normandy campaign has probably evolved over the years. What, if you could talk to the Paul Woodadge just starting out, what would you tell him, or where would you tell him that he's wrong, or at least he missed the point? What has changed for you over the years?
Oh, that's a very good question. I don't think I'd tell myself to do anything differently. I would just say, kind of, don't be surprised if you go a different direction. I talk about the dark days of the 1980s, and what I mean by that is that the Germans had all the best kit, their aircraft were better, their tanks were better, their commanders are better, and we were muddling our way through and crap at everything. And I won't name the authors who were kind of pushing that agenda, but some of them are still with us and some of them are not. And I understand now that was a direct connection to the fact that this is the Cold War, and the NATO has to sell the idea that small amounts of good stuff beats lots amount of average stuff, because that's what we were trying to sell. The Russians at that time had more of everything than the Western had. So we're extolling the virtues of your Michael Wittmanns and your German, your Tiger races and all that kind of stuff. And now we're through the Cold War. Well, the first one, I don't know what's going to happen. Let's not project too far ahead. But now we're realizing that the German kit wasn't quite as good as we thought it was, and their tank commanders weren't quite as great, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think I wouldn't have wanted to miss going through that era, because it was part of the process. I mean, people like John and me, we talk a lot about the historiography of this. In that you have to have gone through a number of decades of looking at it one way to understand that it's now swinging towards another way, and then it'll swing another way. Also of the opinion we're maybe in danger of swinging it too far the other way now, that the German stuff was all crap. None of it was. All the German tanks were broken down all the time, and the Allies are brilliant at everything. It's no. We've gone from too far the other way to too far this way, and the needle will eventually swing back into the middle. But I think really I would, if I could speak to my younger self, is the devil is in the nuance. The truth is always somewhere in the middle. Don't be pulled into thinking one way or the other. Just let the needle and the water find its level. And like talking to John about let's talk about the American airborne on D-Day, for example. The idea they all missed their drop zones. Oh no, some did considerably miss their drop zones, but a huge majority were pretty damn close to where they were supposed to be. And so some of these sharp binary ways we looked at things, and I looked at them as I was younger, I've realized are not as simple as they purport to be. And it's like this language thing. And don't get me started when people refer to Omaha as a massacre or a tragedy or a disaster. And you go, no, and it's not me slighting those that lost their lives. It's just saying that a certain lexicon of language is built up around D-Day that I think I was victim of when I was younger, and I'm not so now, because I've read more widely and spoken to more people.
Yeah.
We have a listener question from Scott Grimwood, and he take it, Scott, joining the conversation. He mentions Operation Neptune is overlooked when it comes to D-Day, and asks, are there any memorials or recognition to the naval operation in the Normandy area?
Well, you'll see them in October when you're touring with me, Scott. Yes, there are, but not many, because it's very abstract. John's done battlefield touring. When you're standing in a field and you're talking about, well, the Germans are over there and the Americans come over there, you don't need to use much kind of stimulation to understand that. But looking at a big grey flat ocean, saying, okay, so there were destroyers and there were transports over there, it's very difficult to relay that to people. So it ends up, we all are guilty of skipping over the naval element. And I know people who, when they buy a big book on D-Day, just skip all the Navy stuff and wait till the men start jumping out of landing craft. And it's a shame. There are a couple of really good books coming out right now. Nick Hewitt, the D-Day, the Sailor's Story, has just come out, which is epic, telling the story of the Royal Navy. And indeed, John mentioned earlier about the sheer number of nations, the sheer number of people that are involved within, not even listed as an official nation, apart on board these ships, is incredible. So the Navy aspect does need talking about more. It's often misunderstood, but there are some monuments, but you have to kind of look for them a bit. There is not one on Omaha Beach to the U.S. Navy or the British Navy, for example. There's a big U.S. Navy monument on Utah Beach, which lists all the LCTs and LSTs things, but not one on Omaha, for example. Which, John, who's written about Omaha, you cannot tell the story of Omaha Beach without bringing in the Navy, and there's nothing there really to acknowledge them. So there's room for improvement on that. And we're all guilty of leaving out the Navy. Well, I'm speaking for myself. I'm guilty of leaving out the Navy a bit sometimes. Sorry.
And I will mention
why the work of our friend Craig Simons is so important.
Of course.
Definitely.
I'll maybe have April or John jump in on this, because I think we do a pretty good job at the National D-Day Memorial of presenting the naval the aspects. So maybe tell our listeners what we have here in Bedford to that.
Oh, absolutely. We have a Navy circle, Neptune Circle.
It's called Jimmy Green Circle.
Yeah, Jimmy, named after one of the LCA pilots, exactly. And every person who takes a tour at the National D-Day Memorial spends at least a few minutes of that tour discussing the Navy components. Because, and I always tell school kids this all the time, it's an amphibious assault. Nothing happens if we don't have a Navy.
Right.
That's right.
Yep.
And in detail, we have a lot of bronze plaques that detail specific histories, everything from the, for example, the merchant mariners, who are often overlooked as well. But we are actually dedicating a plaque this D-Day on the tin cans of D-Day, the destroyers, and the really vital story and role that they played during the invasion. So it's an important part of the story, and we make sure that it's recognized in all of our tours.
And I personally think it's so important connecting the younger generations to that, because, here in Bedford, we're so steeped in the Army National Guard history, but we're in Virginia, and there's a big naval history as well.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
bringing that to the children,
That's right.
and, seeing those two components, I think is really, really important.
Absolutely.
Well, as the son of a World War II sailor, no one has to twist my arm.
That's right.
of the fleet.
So you're saying you spend a little extra time over there in the circle?
Depends on the tour, but we've had Navy groups, sailors from individual ships who come tour, and
we used to have reunion groups. I
Exactly.
remember many of the reunion groups, USS Tide and many others. Who
The
came, the Rich, and those were really meaningful.
And we have
very
the
special.
Naval Academy alumni here a couple of years back,
Right.
dedicated their plaque. So,
and registered for the 80th is a Marine who was aboard the Texas. And I'm eager to meet him and see what he remembers.
another lesser known story that we tell too. With
True. The Marines were there.
role.
They weren't on the beaches, but they were there.
There was a role there. Yeah.
Scott also mentions there was some great coverage of the naval operations in D-Day radio coverage.
Yeah.
Very
Good point on that.
Well, I think it also just generally reminds us that there is a little bit too much focus on the point of the spear, not the big body of the spear behind it. And
Right.
the American military particularly was very, very tail heavy, and that was its strength. And I one of the things I don't like about the anniversaries is the interviewer's obsession with someone having jumped out of an aircraft or jumped on a beach at the expense of someone who was in the engine room on a destroyer, or a simple task of putting ammunition onto the Rhino platforms to be dragged ashore in Omaha. We're all a little bit guilty of focusing on the really exciting kind of sexy veterans in that sense, and of course that's not how the war was won. The war was won by an incredibly my great uncle was on D-Day as a platoon commander. My granddad, from my mother's side of the family, never left England. He was anti-aircraft the entire war, 6 years, anti-aircraft. The only time he ever was there when a base he was at was actually buzzed by a German fighter. He was in the toilet and missed it. So it's 6 years in anti-aircraft, and actually the one time there was an aircraft near him, he actually missed it. But he did his bit. He did his bit. Was very proud of his Defence and War Medal he came back with, and so we're a bit guilty of focusing on that exciting element there. And Normandy was a stepping stone. We get it a lot as tour guides. A family will contact us and say, a granddad was on a Utah Beach on D-Day, and they give you the unit, and you email back and said, he was on D-Day on Utah Beach. He was in the 79th Division. He came ashore on the 12th, 14th, 16th, or even in August or September. And they go, no, he was on D-Day. And you go, I think what's happened in your family is he always said he landed on Utah Beach. And then since he's passed away, you've added the fact he landed on D-Day. And they go, have we? And they go, yes, because 836,000 GIs came ashore on Utah Beach between June and November, and about 25,000 on the first day. So in sheer mathematical probability, if you meet someone who came ashore on Utah Beach, there's a 96% chance it was way after D-Day. And then, but you're disappointing them because, he wasn't involved in this.
Yeah.
No, but he fought in the battle for Cherbourg. And so, and that's where the public have got a little bit, obsessed about June the 6th, which kind of brings us back to what we were saying earlier. We need to remember it was chapter 1 of a very long, bloody chapter.
Yeah, I think you're so right about that, because I've actually had family members and similar experiences over the years where they were disappointed when they learned their family member actually wasn't D-Day, like D-Day.
Yeah.
And they're like, so he wasn't a D-Day veteran, or, and it's like, well, he came in under intense fighting on D+6. So, yes, he was. But I think, the day has been so emphasized that sometimes we focus on these really what we deem heroic stories when it comes down to it, whatever your role on D-Day, you were a hero nonetheless. You were there. You were contributing. Your life was in danger, like everyone else's. And I think sometimes that gets overshadowed.
I think we give that misperception sometimes because we're the D-Day memorial.
Yeah.
And we've collected the names of all of the Allied fallen that we've identified who died on June 6th.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
But I always point out,
there were many days that followed.
There's June 7th.
Right.
There's June 8th.
Yeah.
And
thousands more died in those days that followed.
Exactly right. We
the Battle of St. Lo, or
we tell the story of D-Day, but we have to tell a complete story, and we try to do that. Sometimes we only have an hour of a tour, so we can't hit everything. But
you sow the seeds.
We hope so.
That's right.
Absolutely. Let me ask a question. I'm curious. As a resident of Normandy, I had the opportunity to sit in some Zoom sessions and work with a group from the University of Caen who was studying kind of the environmental impact on the Normandy sites and projecting some interesting projections of where the shoreline might be in 50 and 100 years. And in your opinion, how has increased tourism in Normandy been deleterious to some of the sites, like, for instance, Pointe du Hoc?
Well, it has. Yeah. I mean, it absolutely has. And I don't know how. I don't have the answers to these questions. But yeah, when I was first coming to Normandy in my teens, Pointe du Hoc, you ran around it and climbed over things, and now it's a set path through a set fenced off part. The bunkers are being on the cliff edges are being closed off and fenced off because there are cliff collapses, and this would have been happening regardless of the visitor footfall, because erosion happens, but the visitor hasn't helped, and the dunes near Utah Beach are similarly affected, and Sword and Juneau, the beach sand is affected by partly when they expanded the ferry port at Ouistreham. So when Canadians go to Juneau Beach, like Norma is watching, and you see these incredible, vivid, original photos of the seawall there, well, now you can just walk straight off the beach at Bernier-sur-Mer onto the pathway behind it. It's like a 2-inch at times step. Well, on D-Day, it was 6 foot of sand on a curved kind of reinforced wall. And that's because of the sands have been shifting, because of the ferry port, and because of course Searle and this, that, and the other. So, and Omaha has changed substantially from what it looked like. I mean, it was substantially different to what it looked like on June the 6th, a week later, let alone 80 years later, because it became a working harbor. The shingle was removed away from huge chunks to make a building material there. And so it presents sometimes a bit of a difficulty when you've got a group there who've arrived at Omaha Beach. The image they have is partly from Saving Private Ryan, partly from video games, and partly from the photos they've seen from June the 6th. And the environment they're looking at in front of them doesn't always tally with what they're expecting. So you have to kind of unload what they go, okay, so these houses were here, but those ones weren't. The beach would have been differently there. That wasn't there. This was there. and which in some ways is why, if I keep banging on about the inland areas have maybe changed less. Villages have got bigger, especially south of Caen, around Cherbourg. But there were battlefields. The book I'm working on right now about La Haye de Puy, which I can't wait to take John down there one day and show him what I found. Me and my mate Colin were out there the other week. We found a bridge that the 812th Tank Destroyer Unit took and held, and we don't think anything had changed at all in 80 years. The buildings are exactly the same. The road is exactly the same. You're like, wow. And yet the beaches, you don't have that. There are beach huts for tourists on Bernier-sur-Mer Sword Beach. There's souvenir stands, cafes, things, and life goes on. But yeah, the environmental impact has been quite severe, and will keep on affecting things. And I don't know whether there'll be more moves to close bits off. I don't know, but it has definitely changed things.
So yeah, I mean, along those lines, researchers at a couple of U.S. universities, I think Utah and Texas, found that they analyzed soil from Omaha Beach and found that you could still find fragments in there,
Yep.
like 4% of the soil sample. And I remember you and I were walking Omaha Beach, and you quite rightly pointed out, well, look at some of the stones you pick up; they're still scarred by ordnance.
Yep.
And that's something I wanted to mention for anyone who is going to be visiting. It doesn't have to be this year, whenever, that there really still is that kind of tangible sense of what went on there. And so Woody, you mentioned La Haye de Puy and finding the intact bridge, and is there still at any point, as you do your work around Normandy, at any point in the landing beaches themselves or the areas where the fighting took place for the next week or so, that you have found something similar, that just rocks or whatever else that is still marked by you?
Yeah, things are being found and re-examined, and little details are being noticed. And one of my absolute heroes, who's good 30 years younger than me pretty much, is Michael Ackerman, who comes on my channel, who's a Californian filmmaker basically, but he
very talented guy.
Spends hours poring over these high resolution aerial photos of Omaha Beach and overlaying it on Google Earth, and he finds stuff. And when he comes on my channel, I nod along, pretending I know exactly. Of course, you know about this, don't you, Paul? I go, oh yes, knowing that I live 15 minutes away. He's never been to Omaha Beach, and he's finding stuff about it that I didn't know, and people who live on that beach didn't know. And that's the big hope, is that he has skill sets that I just don't have, because I'm older, and I've managed to work how to live stream to YouTube and things like that, but it's an uphill curve at times, and that's the hope, is that people will go to a depth of understanding using skill sets that we just didn't have. I mean, Stephen Fisher's new book on Sword Beach, you must get Stephen on at some point, great historian. He was helping out. I think he either invented it himself, or he found a way of people would tell him the height of a stone wall in Vers-sur-Mer off Gold Beach today, knowing that wall hasn't changed in 80 years, right? So the wall is now 7 foot 6 inches tall. He's then got an aerial photo of tanks going past that wall on D-Day. By plotting where the sun was on that day on D-Day, and by measuring the shadow across the road, he can work out exactly what time that photo was taken. And he was able to give James Holland, for his Brothers in Arms book about the Shorehead Rangers, updated information that just refined the knowledge from the war diaries. And he was saying it can't have been 10:15. It had to be after 11 because of the shadow. And this is insanely fantastic, and you go, wow, what? Stephen's an archaeologist. So I think we got a random message from the other week. Do you know how tall the steeple is at Lyon-sur-Mer, the church? I said, no, I don't. But someone knew how to use an architectural thing on their phone, and went there and measured it and said it's whatever it is, 86 meters or something. And he worked out something from that, again, to do with shadows. I mean, it blows my mind that people can do that kind of stuff. And the books that I do, and John done a lot more, in 30 years' time, people will be looking at it like at the primitive ways they were writing books back then. They weren't even using a shadow understanding. Honestly,
How could they have missed this? Yeah, I know when I hear it
I
makes
don't
me
believe
feel
it.
so small and limited. Like,
Your books will always have power, staying power.
I'd like to believe that.
We have a related question from Scott, kind of keeping with the theme of some of the lingering scars to the landscape there in Normandy, but asking about some specific things that I would perhaps venture to say are more dangerous or have more of a long-lasting environmental impact, such as fuel from sunken ships or unexploded ordnance. Tell us about that. Is that still a problem?
it's not as much of a problem as you might think it would be. And it all goes back from the fact that Utah, Omaha, the other beaches to some extent were used as harbors for the next months and months. So huge amounts of clearing was done then. So maybe once every couple of years, a fishing trawler will pull up a mine. And I'm not dismissing the danger of pulling up a mine if you're going out there. You know, Francois and Pierre are going out one morning and, oh, merde, il y a un mine, and they pull up a mine there. But it doesn't happen enough for it to freak people out. And but it happens enough to know exactly what to do, and they would call the authorities, and the demineur come in. And I was walking on Utah Beach with a tour group about 10 years ago, and a bit of dune had collapsed, and there was a bomb. There was literally a bomb sitting there, like a 250-pound bomb for an American aircraft. So it was pre-cell phone days. I went back to a cafe and rang at the gendarme. The gendarmes arrived and set a mark around. Then the EED people arrived I had to take my group on. I assume they either deactivated on site, or I didn't hear anything in the news about it, so it wasn't a big deal. So but fuel was an issue. I talked about Port-en-Bessin being one of my favorite places where the commandos fought in a little fishing port. Well, that's where the Pluto pipeline came out for months after D-Day, which leaked like a sieve. So it's incredible. It's one of the top ports in France for Coquille Saint-Jacques. What's that in English? The shell seafood thing. I just can only think of the French word, Coquille Saint-Jacques. It's scallops. Yeah, sorry, my French brain. But you couldn't eat the scallops in Port-en-Bessin for like 20 years after all because of the fuel, because of all the gasoline that had leaked there. And it took decades. It's the same happened off Utah Beach. The mussel beds there were affected for a long time. I think it's fairly safe to eat the mussels and oysters now, 80 years on. But yeah, 70% of the Normandy's orchards were destroyed in World War II, which changed the way the French economy went. You could argue that the French naturally moved more towards beer and wine in this region than they had done from cider, but partly it's because they haven't got the apple trees anymore, because you can't just instantly make an orchard. Orchards are long-term projects. So there are all these kind of hidden changes to Normandy that you don't necessarily notice. I notice them now because I've got a French family there, and they'll point these things out. I mean, it's the hedgerows, the whole bocage, the whole way that affected things, and the bridging of rivers changed the way French farmers for years after all crossed rivers, because the British would put a new bridge in, and so that's where they started going. So there are lots of little things that are there if you know what you're looking for.
So interesting to hear how it just affected kind of day-to-day life to this day. It's really interesting.
Yeah, even the Norman cows, of course, took great casualties too.
Yeah,
and I wonder how that affected dairy production for the next 30 years after World War II or whatever. I mean, that just little things like that are easy to overlook, gives you a sense of the meaning of this battle on so many levels. So what do you were out there in the figurative and not so figurative trenches for many years, guiding people as a battlefield historian. And of course, you had folks coming from all over the world who were drawing upon your expertise. So how did the national background and maybe the culture of whoever your guest might have been, how did that shape how you would conduct a tour? So like, let's imagine you had a German group versus a Canadian group or an American group. How did you approach each
Well,
differently, if at all?
it did change things. Although I have to say, in my career, 90% of all my customers were always American. So the great proportion were American. Just kind of where I kind of built my trade, and then Mr. and Mrs. Smith told Mr. and Mrs. Jones, and so that's where I built up my kind of clientele. But um, I would always make the point of slipping into Americans that the Brits were doing this up the road, and the same to Brits that the Americans doing this down the road. And I would try and remind people that those national flags we use over the beaches are only a broad indicator. They're not precise. There are Americans on Gold Beach, there are Brits on Omaha Beach, Brits on Utah Beach, there are French on Sword Beach, etc. So there are Brits on Juno Beach, and that's not counting all the Navy and the Air Force flying above. So I always try and remind people that don't get too caught up in the national label of, if you're American, you must only see the American beaches. And I applaud what you're doing at the memorial there to make sure the British casualties are recorded and kept as well, because it's all, we're all singing, all working together. There are some different ways. Again, the Australians particularly had a very strong movie industry of their own. So they had Australians and New Zealanders, a very kind of keen understanding of the multi-theatre aspect of World War II. So they would have not less of an interest in D-Day, but their involvement in Normandy was less than it had been in other theatres. So you change things a little bit, but broadly, storytelling is storytelling, and information relaying is the same. So I think I approached it more or less the same way. Obviously, now you're getting fewer people who have a direct connection. That's back in the great days of when I was guiding. There seemed to be a veteran on one of the minibuses every week. Mel Brooks took one of my tours once, not with me, one of my staff. Just turned up and wanted to see the Normandy beaches, and so that people who just lived through the war and their children were taking tours more routinely. So he did lots more of connecting it to their own experience. If you happen to know about the unit that they were talking to, sometimes they've been mentioned obscure, the 273rd Quartermaster Signal Company. And go, oh yes, well, I'm not sure where they were, but you pull something out. But yeah, I think I approached it pretty much the same way, really.
Woody, at the National D-Day Memorial, we really work very hard to educate a student population. So we know that, we've all had this privilege in our lives of getting to know World War II veterans and basically just having them in our midst for most of our lives. And we know that that's that treasure they're leaving us. And so I imagine with your younger audience, members that you're trying to attract, and what ways do you try to engage with a younger audience, because it's going to be up to them now to pass on the stories that we've learned from our World War II veterans. So how has your interaction been with younger people, and how do you engage with them when you tell these stories?
I wish I was more successful at it. I have all the analytics of my YouTube channel. I have 0% under 16 watching my channel, and about 1% 16 to 21 or something. So the majority of my viewers are exactly the same as me and my guests. They are middle-aged white guys predominantly, which is a real shame. Not exclusively. There are people, I have all sorts of people as well, but I don't really reach the younger people, and I wish I had a magic wand to be able to reach people. I mean, there are channels that do sort of 5-minute, 10-minute histories, which are very, very good with animations and flashy graphics. I don't do that. They appeal much more to younger people, or more maybe younger people find them more easy. I think if younger people would find me and give me a try, I think they would find it more interesting. I don't fall into those ideas that, because they're young, they've all got 30-second attention spans. I don't see that in my stepdaughters. I don't see that with the young people I know. It's just I think I've got to find better ways of meeting them in the middle somewhere. And I'm a one-man band. I do everything myself. I do 5 or 6 shows like this every day, another one in a few hours' time, and I haven't got the time to work at it. But I wish I could reach younger people. I'm grateful that I reach people from different nationalities. I've had guests from 39 different nations so far. So I've got a big audience in the Philippines, for example, and India, which I'm really pleased about, Netherlands, Belgium. But if I have a secret way to get through to the young people, I would love to know, because I struggle.
Well, we would certainly recommend your channel because it's superb, and I think a lot of young people can learn a lot from it. So, yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious your answer to this one because, frankly, we need some guidance on it sometimes. How do you approach the task of balancing historical accuracy with telling engaging stories?
Mm. Well,
How do you balance this interest in World War II that is so significant with the unavoidable fact that it's also a terrible story of human tragedy and suffering and inhumanity?
well, it's tough, and John would have the same problem as writing a book. You know, you have to get people in the door. You've got to get them. So these days, whether it's a book or podcast, or you've got to have the exciting stories of men running along by tanks and shooting at them, and you've got to have that visceral the big approach, but you've got to keep it grounded. You've got to have the context of why, where, what are they doing, where are they going, and it's hard. It's a very hard thing, and because people's way of learning are so different. And that's good. That people are told there are different ways of learning. You know, I'm from the era where I remember left-handed kids having their hands tied behind their backs when I was at school. I remember that elementary school. I remember that. I'm only 55. I'm not 109. I remember that. But now it's accepted that people learn things visually. People learn things, touching, physically. I try and use those kind of tools. Try and when I'm starting to write now, because I'm 45 minutes away from the battlefield I'm writing about. I'm trying to give that texture. I'm trying to build up a picture of, the height of the stone wall and the color of the stone and the waving reeds in the water that are being pushed by the breeze, that kind of stuff, to try and add an element of storytelling. And it's a very, very hard little bit to get in there. There are great historians who are doing incredible work, but their books are a bit encyclopedic. They're the books you turn to look stuff up, but you don't want to sit on a beach and read them when you're on vacation. It's like, which unit is that again? I've forgotten who that was. The happy space. John, you're so lucky that John lives in that little happy space between telling stories and getting his story right, because it's a small select club, but it's not easy. John, what's your views?
Well, I think part of it comes from my journalism background, in the sense of just always learning to humanize a story, I guess, and also the fact that that's what drew me to this. Is the actual personal stories of people, and how we convey that maybe in this larger context. Because what in the end, what fascinates me about history is how everyday people, or maybe not so everyday, if it's Eisenhower or whoever, how they are affected by great historical forces and events. Because we can all relate to, you're talking about your grandfather who was, in an anti-aircraft unit, and that was his corner of the war. That's how he was affected by these massive events. And I guarantee you, I would expect that he wasn't the same in 1945 as he was in 1938 or 39, not the same guy. So how is that? How do we come after that? And for some people, yes, it's the dramatic story of Ray Lambert on Omaha Beach or whatever, for other people, it's the mundanities of war and life, but it's still a human story on many levels. And so I think that's maybe is the if there's a sweet spot to be found, maybe that's it somehow. But it's a lot easier said than done too, because you want the factual element of it.
Yep.
And I know what you're talking about, Woody, because there are a number of books that are really good, but gosh, they're just all this dirt. And so for history nerds like us, yes, we'll delve into that and we'll learn from it. But I don't know that the average person is going to approach that. And I think that's always the challenge, I suppose, that how we tell the story without sensationalizing it or exploiting it.
No, right? I agree, and I think it's another thing I was thinking about bringing up is that we're maybe thinking, oh, Woody's being really provocative now, but we're over idolizing the greatest generation to the point where their achievements don't seem attainable. That we're putting them towards the levels of superheroes, when in fact they were flawed human beings who didn't understand the complexities of what they're involved in, and they didn't necessarily know why they're running up that beach. They formulated these ideas later. I can think of wonderful veteran friends of mine who would give these wonderful articulate, descriptions years later of, we knew that the jackboot of Nazi tyranny was stamping over Europe, and I, as a red-blooded American or Brit or Israel, had to go there to be part of this monumental effort to right that wrong. And you're thinking, this is brilliant, but you kind of know that's not really what they were thinking about when they were 19. They were thinking about, am I going to get shot through the arse today? Is my friend going to get killed? Am I going to get killed? And I think we need to relate them to ourselves. And if you're reading about World War II guys and they've been put on too high a level, we can't connect ourselves to it because it was a civilian army. That's, John writes about it all the time. It's the only army in history where the majority of people in it didn't really want to be there. Certainly, they didn't have career aspirations in the military. They were doing their job. My granddad couldn't wait to get back home out of the army. That was he'd done his 6 years, and that's it. After 6 years, he'd missed the birth of his second child, and he'd missed the formative years of his first child, and had to re-establish relationships with, because he was away for 6 years. He got a bit of furlough, leave occasions, and which is a funny story in itself. Some of those times I learned out that my mum's birth was 9 months after a 48-hour pass, and my granddad said, the second thing I did was take my boots off, which is but that reminds me that my granddad was just like me. He was a young man away from home who lived through this stuff, not really understanding it. And I think somehow balancing, respecting what these guys did, accepting the fact the Greatest Generation label is meant to be a compliment, and it was not meant with any giving them any burden, but it has become a bit of a burden, and bringing it down to accepting the fact that they were relatable human beings with all their differences and understandings, and that's hard. The reverence is, I understand where it comes from, but I'm a bit troubled by it sometimes.
Yeah, because it gets to be a bit much. Like you said, the hero worshiping, it's a caricature, to use that word again.
Yeah.
And it overlooks the complexities of all the different kinds of people, and some pretty ugly sides to this too, that what you and I have talked about many times, especially in relation to race or gender or whatever. These are very difficult times, and that a lot of things are happening that we would find appalling. That's just the reality of it, and so to understand maybe that larger context, I think takes greater delving and studying. And I think the easier thing for most people who have lives to live after all and whatever, and they can't devote their whole life to this, is to delve into or to just see the image, to say, okay, well, and to respect it, which is great. And one of the things in the U.S. that's happened that I think is a great development, although lending toward caricature a little bit, is a much higher regard for Vietnam veterans, which was long overdue, who are, and Korean War veterans too, are sort of in the shadow of the veterans of these two wars on some levels. And so I think that's been a very good development, but I think that just by the nature of this beast, I suppose, it does lend toward that kind of caricature. And that's so we historians always push back against it, and maybe it's the reason why no one likes us. I don't know. But
I've been Mr. Buzzkill so many times. When you go, I'm going to have to put the historian hat on now and go, excuse me, that meme you've just shared isn't actually D-Day, that's Operation Torch. And you're just spoiling everybody's fun.
You guys are so fun at parties.
Especially with movies, what are such a buzzkill.
But I think it's so important what y'all are saying too, though, because I think in order to relate, going back to younger people, you have to make these people that we're sharing their stories about, that they are human beings. They are normal men and women who did a job. And as most of these World War II veterans would tell you, they were doing a job. They did not like the label heroes. They felt like they were doing what anybody else would do. And I think to be able to tell these stories, and I know both of you, both through World War II TV and John, many of your books and everything, you've talked about the mundane aspects of the war. I mean, we always talk about the battles and everything, but what goes on in those weeks and months and everything leading up to it, and the sickness and the, living in mud and the heat and the, lack of food or all the things that are very mundane and not so pretty, side of the war or things that I think people can certainly understand the human aspect of it. And I think that's important to continue to convey those things.
Well, it's relatable, isn't it? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
Watching Masters of the Air, which we did, a lot of us, I have no comprehension of what it was like to climb into a B-17 and be part of 1,000 bombers flying over there. But I can appreciate being cold. I can appreciate that people around me are depending on me to do my job. And sometimes I screw up. It goes back to this question we had about Montgomery earlier, is that why have we expected generals to get it right all the time? Because human beings don't get it right all the time. I have days where everything I touch turns to, crap, and other days where I feel like I can do no wrong. But why should we expect a general who's away for 3 or 4 years from his family and dealing with things he's going through? And Montgomery had all sorts of issues due to the loss of his wife and pain from First World War injuries, things like that. Why should we expect him to get it right every single day? I don't get it right every day. Do you get it right every day? Hosting a podcast, taking a tour?
I mean, I do. I don't know about.
Well, you're a woman, of
For
course. So
yourself.
I don't know why I work with them.
Kidding. But I mean, the boss is right here. I gotta say that, right? Would now be a good time to jump in with a listener question.
Yeah.
All right. Norma has another question. She would love to hear Woody and John McManus's impressions of the Juno Beach Center.
Oh.
Go ahead, Woody.
That reaction might tell us all we need to know.
I'm glad it's there. I'm glad it took a long time coming. There were for years and years when I was first coming there was nothing for the Canadians to visit. The thing is, the giveaway is in the title. It's a center in some ways more than a museum. If you're a French person going there, a big chunk of it is explaining Canada's history. The provinces, the background, the founding years, the Polish ancestry, the Scottish, all that kind of stuff, and the gift shop does sell maple syrup and beavers. It does sell. So there's a kind of a, but it's not maybe a perfect museum, but then museums aren't, because my beef with the Juno Center is it rather just ignores the massacres that were happening after D-Day, SS killing Canadians, and Canadians getting a bit overzealous against the SS, and it kind of just kind of leaves that aside. Let's not go there. Let's not. It's too complicated. It's too nasty. Well, why not? Why not examine that? Why not examine what happens when men from one army discover what the other army has been doing to their prisoners, and then how that escalates more violence. But maybe that's because I want that complexity in the museum, but the people maybe coming to the museum don't maybe always want to be confronted with what human beings are capable of doing to each other. So I may be expecting something from it that wasn't what they were trying to set out to do, and not what the public want anyway. So that's my. So it's all right. It's okay, but I feel it's a slightly a missed opportunity to really get into the heart of it. John.
Yeah, I'm glad it's there too. I think it's a net asset more than anything. I echo your thoughts 100%. I've always had the sense that there's a lot of governmental and diplomatic entities involved, that this is sort of selling Canada, for lack of a better way to put it. And I really have no problem with that on its face. But I'm with Woody in that, as an historian, I really want the deeper kind of exploration of the Canadian experience in Normandy. And not just at Juno Beach, of course, but beyond, like you said, what happened at Abbey des Ardennes and the other spots where the Canadian 3rd Division is tangling with the 12th SS and the atrocities the 12th SS are perpetrated. Because after all, you could argue, in a way, that's why we're fighting this campaign in the first place, because of what the SS represents and how they operate. I believe what happened at Abbey des Ardennes is one of the seminal moments in the Battle of Normandy. It's something that I make sure to talk about all the time in my classes. I bring it up anytime. It's not as well known here in the U.S. I think maybe it should be. But I also, what I really do like about the center is that, as I understand it, there are young Canadians, like college
Yep.
age students or whatever, who are always there, working on internships. And I think that is terrific. I wish we had something like that in the US that was permanent. We've had programs like that. I was part of one of them called the Normandy Scholars, which was an amazing experience for me as a graduate student. And I can't imagine how formative that must be for many young Canadians to spend that time in Normandy, to work there, to be immersed in this. You talk about a gateway drug.
Yeah.
Overall, I'm really glad it's there. And one of the drums I've always been beating, and will continue, is the recognition for the Canadians for what they did. Per capita, I don't know that there's any other Western Allied country involved in Normandy except maybe the French, who is sacrificing at such a major level. And pretty much all these guys,
yeah,
you know what I mean? And so pretty much all these Canadian guys are volunteers too. We can't say that from the US and Britain. And so I just think the Canadian role is so outsized, in terms of the size of the country and the impact they have on the battle and the campaign that's going to follow. So I like that the center draws some attention to that, I guess.
And it is evolving. There are younger people involved. Alex Black, the historian, is involved there, and other people. So it is their Dieppe exhibition was pretty damn good recently. So that it museums will start one direction and move another way, and that's good. So I think finally Canada has kind of lost its forgotten tag for Normandy because of the work of Terry Kopp and David O'Keefe and Ted Barris and Mark Zelk and others. It's maybe less well known, but it's, I think, maybe Gold and Sword are dropped a little bit behind in some ways, because Brits will often go to American beaches first because of Saving Private Ryan, because of Band of Brothers, because that's what there hasn't been a British D-Day movie ever, really. Overlord, actually made in the 1960s, was a low budget black and white affair, but not particularly good. So yeah, the Juno Centre it's helping, but I'm a tough crowd. There's lots of things I want that I don't see, and I critique myself, and I critique the museums, and I critique the way tourism works as well. So sometimes because I'm middle-aged and cynical.
We're crotchety old men.
And we like that. We're aren't we? Yeah.
So
we had
here's what
we had made it so far without the train. So for all of our listeners,
I wondered about that.
The train as promised. But we did get much farther into the program than I thought we would.
All right, so speaking of all these issues of popular memory and respect for the past and all that, so what's your feeling about the possible Tribute to Heroes movie theater that might be built in the Carentan area, which is often called like a T-Day theme park, fair or unfair? What do you think about it?
I don't know enough about it. Not enough information has really been given for me to form an opinion. What happened at the beginning is someone cottoned on to this idea that it was D-Day land, which was taking the words by the French, politicians behind it, sort of misquoted him really, and it meant people made a judgment. They immediately came up with this idea that it was a theme park and it was going to have the Omaha Beach, roller coaster, and it clearly was never going to be that. And I think I'm going to give it a chance. I think there's a lot of people behind it who seem to know what they're doing. And it comes back to what we were saying earlier about reaching people by different methods, because there's the big famous medieval event, I forget what it's called, down in sort of Brittany area, where people go and watch, jousting, and it's thousands and thousands go there. And I think that's where they're seeing it. They're seeing it as more of, instead of a museum, you go and see a certain amount of people in costume and holograms and things like that, which part of me goes, oh no, really? And the other part of me goes, oh really? Because it could go either way. It could be really, really good, and it could be a bit dodgy, we say in English. But I'm going to give it a chance, because if it reaches what they're saying it's going to be, which is the audience will sit on this moving terrace thing that goes through 5 or 6 halls for an hour or so, and it teaches about the Battle of Normandy. Excuse me. if it's as good as it could be fantastic. It could be absolutely brilliant. I mean, John, in the classroom, you're going to be embracing technology when it comes in. So I have nothing against it, but at the same time, I'm going to wait until there's a product to actually see. We will just see. It's going to be in Caen. It's not going to be in Carrington. It's going to happen in Colombelle, so near where the steel works. Whereas it's not going to be built on a battle. It's just an industrial area. There's nothing there. It's not going to be on a foot. It's not going to be built on some battlefield that needs preserving. It's in a place that has good public transport access, to trams and what have you. In Caen, so it could work. At its worst, it would be another way of getting across D-Day to people. And its best, it could be a really fantastic way, and it could maybe save some of the crowds from going to places like Pontyhoc and overcrowding some of the sites. So I'm trying to be positive about it, because that's in my nature, I think. Although I can be cynical and grumpy, I'm both. I'm a paradox.
Aren't we all?
That's right. So, Woody, I have a question about in your experience as a guide and historian. I mean, I can remember over the years, especially early on when the memorial was first built, how many D-Day veterans actually visited the memorial, and they would be on my tour. And, you're just in awe because you're like, they need to lead the tour. I'm just, but it was always, those were always some of my favorite experiences, of course. So in your experience, what are some of your most memorable stories or anecdotes from veterans or family members that you've encountered?
Well, it was the funny ones, really. It was the times when they're not talking about the war per se, but they are, because they're telling you about friendship. They're telling you about the being away from home aspects, and some of them were just so funny. And then they'd be moving, and then they'd be funny again. And I mean, Wild Bill Garnier, who I got to know quite well, would have me on the ropes with laughter. It's like, stop! I'm going to soil myself. Stop making me laugh. Earl McClung was so funny. Wally Parr, one of the Pegasus Bridge veterans, just had a turn of phrase that was fantastic. And I've got a whole host of stories of meeting veterans that aren't ever going to be going in a book, because they mostly involve swearing and this, that. But it's that because it humanized them. Because I didn't, even at that point, I didn't want to put them on this pedestal of being people that I couldn't go and speak to. They weren't dignitaries. They weren't the royal family. They weren't, they were just people who'd done a job. And so when they shared their funny stories, it brought them down to my level, and that's they're the moments I treasure. But of course, sometimes the insight they would give to a particular battle or a campaign or a day, and maybe it would just be a look. They would just look at you, or they just say something like, terrible days, and they'd look off it a bit, and you knew that the power was what they weren't saying, not what they were saying. So yeah, too many to mention, really. But I wish I did appreciate it at the time, but I didn't appreciate it enough. Now I realize that door's closed. I realized, why didn't I don't know. I didn't record enough. I could have recorded more conversations. I could have taken more notes. I don't know.
Yeah, but you know what? I mean, that's just life. I mean, in a way, that's where the realness comes from of the relationship. Is you're not doing that, and you're just relating as human beings. And there's I think a kind of intimacy in the tough moments, relating the tough stuff, because that's not an easy thing for anybody to talk about. So it's a privilege in the sense to be on the receiving end of that. But in a way, it can't be forced, or I don't know how I'm gonna say it. But so yeah, I mean, to me, I get what you're saying, but because I feel the same way, but I also think it just wouldn't have been that practical, So yeah, some couple questions for you as we're down to our last 8 minutes or so here. So you've established WW2 TV as a major and really highly entertaining resource. I can't recommend this highly enough. It's incredible the level of content you've done and how you illustrate it and all the different scholars you bring in, and it's a major resource for anyone who wants to know about any aspect of World War II. And I'm not just talking about the average person. I'm talking about scholars who are doing research. The good idea to be conversant with whatever pertinent shows would work in that regard. So I'm wondering, how did the idea for this come to you? And then beyond that, what's your vision for it in the future?
Well, like all good ideas, it was unplanned. I was guiding regularly and getting to the point where I was feeling the repetition. It was like same day, deja vu, same story, same place. So I took a kind of year out in 2018 to kind of think. I thought I wanted to make documentaries. I bought myself some camera gear and went out and started doing some bits and pieces. And then I kind of liked doing that, but I hated the editing. I hated the drain of enthusiasm of just sitting with Premiere Pro out and making transitions and cutting and stuff. And I hated it. It took me like 17 years to make a first 20-minute video. Not really, but it felt like it, right? and I thought, oh God, I've invested this money and it's not been what I wanted it to be. And then COVID happened and I couldn't do guiding. And I thought, well, what can I do? So I just hit upon the idea of using Zoom as it was then, and then I've moved on to other things since then, and just speaking to my mates. And pretty much the first thing I ever did was a 17-hour live stream on June the 6th. That was 2020, which John came on at some point with Joe Balkowski. Mm-hmm. And then I realized, hey, I can do this live, no editing, get more content out. And the laziness in me is that when I press end stream, I can be in the kitchen having a Mars bar and a pint of beer a minute later. And the program stands and falls on what we said live. And the live thing is the interaction. Is that there's a brilliant community I've developed, and Scott Grimwood is part of it, Norma's part of it, who are there. They're there before I start streaming. They're there after I'm streaming. They know each other. They visit each other. They recommend books to each other, and they look after each other. And people come on just to say, I'm not going to be on tonight because I'm in hospital, but I want to say hello.
So they're letting you know they're not watching because
I'm not. Sorry, I'm not doing this. I'm having my leg amputated.
I never got RSVPs when I was in television.
So I had no idea. It was a stopgap because I didn't have anything else to do, and I thought, well, if I get to 50 shows, I've done 1,040 or something now in 4 years. It's insane how many. And the single biggest question I get is when are you getting close to running out of ideas? I go, you should see the Word document I keep on my desktop with the ideas of people contacting me all the time. 3 books came in the post today from publishers and authors of, and I basically I'll bring any subject on. There's no subject too niche for me. There was one. Well, someone came to me with a proposition to talk about the change of drilling machines in the Royal Army Dental Corps between 1942 and 1943 in a particular area of Egypt or something. It's like, whoa, that's niche.
Gosh, that sounds fascinating.
Podcast topic.
That's right.
I could do one about the work of the Royal Army Dental Corps. That would be good, but that was a little bit too narrow. So I just want to keep going on and bringing different voices in from different nations and different perspectives, because one of the problems is that it's very easy to gather people together of like minds because we know each other. Me, John, we know James Holland, Peter Caddick Adams, and so you thrust us in a room and say, Market Garden, we'll talk. There'll be lots of nodding because we've read the same sources. We're the same age. We're the same gender. We're the same this. We're the same color. What I want is someone who brings a different voice and goes, a Dutch person who's 23 or something, going, no, you've got that completely wrong. That's not how they felt about it in Nijmegen or something, and so that's where I want to go. So to me, that it's things like the Sino-Japanese War, which I know John is very interested in, bringing in people from Japan, from China, from Thailand, from Taiwan, from across that area, their perspectives, which I find are often totally different to my perspectives. And it's not that they're right and I'm wrong or I'm right. They're just different, and it fuels conversation. So I want to just keep on going, bringing people in. And I have to fight the people who send me emails because why are you letting women on to talk about tanks?
Oh,
I get them, and
Well, and speaking of keeping the conversation going, the chat is just blowing up with everyone saying World War II television is the best. It's great. Norma says she's often said it's like a university program with the best lecturers in the world on Second World War history for the cost of a Starbucks fancy coffee
thank
a
you,
month.
Norma.
So grateful for Woody's work. They say that the World War II television TV sidebar group is outstanding. So they apparently
They're
have their
amazing.
own little group
Yes.
sidebarring, and which is very much what we're seeing in the chat today. It's been a great kind of conversation of them having some real community there too, which I think is really cool.
And that's it. If Don asked me where I want to see it going, I want to see this community develop. I mean, we're also part of the We Have Ways independent company community with James Holland and Al Murray have developed, which is way beyond what they could have imagined. I mean, sharing history is all well and good. That's fantastic, but I'm not going to overstate the work we do, but helping people make friends, helping people connect with people is really important as well. And you're giving a platform to people to come on and share their work and share it's so fantastic. It's very hard to get into conventional TV, to get on there. They want the same people, the same talking heads, and some of the people I bring on, I like it when they're not very slick sometimes, because it reminds other people that not everybody can be James Holland. Me and John talked the other day about there must be something James Holland is not good at. But if there is something, he's not found it. He must do a really crap omelette or something. He can he does podcasting, TV. He writes brilliantly, fiction, non-fiction, small books, children's books, but I like it when someone comes on and goes, I'm really nervous about this. I'm not a great public speaker. And I go, yeah, but you've got the information. You've spent 30 years studying this thing that you want to bring to people. And I kind of have to kind of corral them a bit and kind of sometimes pull them along a little bit. And that's kind of got better at that over the years. But that's brilliant, because there's no point people working on projects if other people don't see it or read it. And books are one avenue, but YouTube, podcasts, blogs, social media. Some people are doing incredible stuff just on Twitter, just a big long thread about this book is crap and here's why it's crap. You go, and this is brilliant stuff. Or this book is good and this is why it's good.
So we've unfortunately reached the end point. This has just been amazing. It's been so much fun. And Woody, we're just so grateful to you for giving us the time and your perspective. And I have 20 seconds. Just want to ask you a very quick question. Where are you going to be on June 6th this year?
Yeah, I'm going to the pub in the evening. We've got a nice gathering of historians, maybe 20 dropping in and out all evening. But in the day, I'm doing a whole series of live streams, one every hour. So I've got Mike Nyberg's coming on at one point. Garrett Graft's written a new oral history of D-Day. I think Nick Hewitt's coming on to talk about D-Day. So I think Niels is coming on. So I'm going to do like 10 live streams from 9 o'clock to about 6 o'clock. Then I'm in the pub. I'm not going anywhere. No ceremonies. No. I'll be out on 3rd and 4th and the 7th. But the 6th, I'm just sitting right here behind the screen talking to people who can't come to Normandy, basically.
Sounds amazing. Almost a little envious. Yeah, sounds great. Well, it's been such a pleasure to have you on. Thank you. I'd like to thank our live audience. Thank you for the questions, the comments, the feedback. It's just really added to the fun of this. And thank you, April and John. It's just been great.
It's been
and
a lot
Angela,
of fun.
It's been a blast.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Woody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed it, and I'm happy to do it again. If we can do that deeper dive on MacArthur or Montgomery, part 2. Montgomery, part 2. What does Woody really think? We didn't do Market Garden, for goodness sake.
Wow.
Let's make a date.
or the dental drills. I think
Yeah.
that'd be even
Yeah.
better.
And I wrote down cliched visions from the movies. That could be a whole nother podcast like that. I mean, see, we got all
That'd
kinds
be
of.
a really good one.
And you have a standing invitation to come to the National D-Day Memorial anytime you're here in the States. We'd love to
I
see
would love
you.
to.
Yeah, you'll love it. It's amazing. Well, you can email our team at podcast@dday.org. If you're enjoying our discussions on World War II and its lasting impact, please subscribe to this podcast, share it with your friends, rate it, leave us a review.